two things together has just been tremendously inspiring to me, and I hope I can inspire you a little bit. There's just no way we're going to be able to go through all the plants of the Bible in one sitting, and so I'm not even going to try. I picked out some of the more important plants that I think that you really need to have an appreciation for, and we'll go there. And then I've got some kind of obscure ones that you might not have thought about, because I want to tickle your intuition and your perception when you're reading scripture, when you see plant references. Hopefully this will give you a little more interest into pursuing what is that plant, and what was it used for. So Claire, if you could, yeah, that might help a little bit with some of the viewings of the slides here. So the first thing before I get started is what plants come to your mind when you think of plants of the Bible? Go ahead and shout it out. Wheat. Mustard. Fig trees. Olives, absolutely. Cucumbers. Yes, they're in the Bible. Leeks, yes. Hyssop. Palm trees, good. Y'all are doing great. We're going to cover some of those plants. I won't have time to, like I said, to cover them all. But there's a lot of plants in the Bible, and we'll take a look at how many perhaps there are totally. But there's other questions that I want to try and answer too, and just to show you how the whole Bible is permeated and filled with plant references. When are plants first mentioned in the Bible? What's the first plant that's mentioned by name other than some generic thing like a shrub or a grass? How many plants are referenced in the Bible? Which plant or plant products are mentioned most often? What are the top 5 plants in terms of the number of times that they're mentioned in the Bible? And then probably the one that I'm going to start on is what types of plant scripture references and uses are there in the Bible? Because there's really different categories of the uses of plants in the Bible that I think that's an important place to start. And some of them you wouldn't have even had an appreciation for if we don't go over it. So that's where I'm going to start is the plant scripture references and particular uses. Well, obviously the first most easy one to figure out is a plant is mentioned in the Bible because it's a plant that's in a particular location, in a story that's in the Bible and Scripture. So a plant as it is in a setting is probably the most logical use of a plant in the Bible. And a good example would be in Genesis 18:1, when God appears to Abraham, and he appears to Abraham next to the terebinth tree. And so all we know is that Abraham sees God next to a terebinth tree. So there's a plant reference in the Bible. This one's a little bit harder to pull out unless you're a Greek and or a Hebrew scholar, and that is plant names that are proper names, either names of people or of places. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. There's a Hebrew town called, the Hebrew name for the town is Bet-Tiane, and you're probably more familiar with the Greek, which is Bethany. Have you ever heard of the town of Bethany? That's where Lazarus was from, that's where he resided. And there's another town called Bethany that's a different town that's across the Jordan River, and that's where John the Baptist did his baptizing, according to John 1:28. And so what does Bethany mean? Well, it actually means house of dates. And so if you didn't know that, you would miss that biblical reference to a plant. So that's something important to know. And that's why I always make my students, when we're researching plants of the Bible, I make them go back and look at the Hebrew and Greeks, so then they can pick up on this when they see it. Oh, they didn't translate it into the word that we're familiar with, dates. They left it as the Greek. The Bethany. Now they appreciate that. Another good one is Gethsemane. And Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, if you look up Gethsemane, it translates into an olive press. And it's a place where they grew olives. And so the Garden of Gethsemane is probably an olive orchard with other plants attached to it. So it's important to know the original Greek and Hebrew, so you can know and appreciate the plant references in the proper names. There's other uses of plants in Scripture. There was symbolic representation, and I'll give you some examples later on where a plant is compared to something else, and so that's called symbolic representation. Plants were very important in Jewish religious ceremonies, and they're still used today. And we actually use plants in some of in Christian ceremonies, and as I mentioned, Jewish faith are still using plants in religious ceremonies today. We don't have the large system of sacrificial offerings anymore the way that the Hebrews did. And that was another use of plants. Plants and plant products were incorporated into sacrificial offerings, and I'll show some scripture references here to that. And obviously plants were an important source of food and of fiber, and that fiber may be used for clothing or other uses of woven fibers that came and originated from plants. Construction materials, obviously there's building materials as well as small utensils that were made out of plants, and there's a lot of references in the Bible to that use of plants. And then finally, plants were also used in architectural decorations. For example, in the temple, that we have step-by-step instructions on how the temple should be made in Exodus, and at the top of some of the pillars in the temple, on the capitals of the pillars, are actually a description of design based on plants. Pomegranates were carved into the tops of the pillars, as well as water lilies, and so that was the design that was used. So plants were used as architectural decoration, and those references appear in the Bible. They were also part of clothing adornment. For example, the ephod that priests wore had these little dangly balls at the bottom of the long. I guess it's close to a cape, an ephod, and they were pomegranates as well. And so clothing adornment, there's references in the Bible of plants there. And certainly there were multiple medicinal uses of plants mentioned in the Bible, very important for perfumes, deodorants. We tend to not always place plants with deodorants in today's society, but imagine a society that relied less heavily on bathing, and think how much more important deodorants would be. I'm convinced that was one of the reasons that you had to tithe your mint before you went to the temple, because what the priests would do is they would take some of that mint and they would throw it on the ground, so all the crowds of people that would be packed in when they came to the temple, when they would crush that mint, it would release the aromas, and it would probably help with all those challenging human body smells that were, your new best found friend. So deodorants were very important. Dyes, a lot of the dyes that were used were from plants and plant products. And then there were some poisons that were plant poisons that are mentioned in the Bible as well. And so many uses of plants. So I wanted to give you an appreciation for the wide variety. And I'm sure there's other uses of plants that I have just forgotten or have glossed over. So let's start answering some of those questions. The first mention of plants in the Bible, you don't have to go very far, like word 180 to 220, depending on which version of the Bible you're reading. And the first reference to a plant in the Bible is in Genesis 1:11. And God said, "Let the earth put forth grass, herb yielding seed, and fruit tree bearing fruit after its kind, wherein is the seed thereof upon the earth." And it was so. And so the first plant that's mentioned in the Bible is grass. We don't know which species of plants, but that's the first plant reference in the Bible. The Hebrew is deshe, and it translates into grass or vegetation. We don't know which plant it was, what species of grass it was, but that's the first mention of plants in the Bible. The first plant that's mentioned by name in the Bible is in this wood carving. This is a wood carving from the mid-1400s of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And so we have this archangel taking Adam and Eve and escorting them out of the Garden of Eden. And the first plant mentioned by name, and you've already mentioned it, is one, you already threw this one out, is in this particular wood carving. So anybody want to take a stab as to the first plant that's mentioned by name? You may have already read it in your handout. Shame on you if you're going to just do that and spit it out. Okay, it's figs. It's not the forbidden fruit, which they're holding in their hand. It's actually figs, the leaves that they're holding to cover, to show some degree of modesty. And so the passage is, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." And that's Genesis 3:7. And so this is the first plant that is mentioned by name is figs. Incidentally, they realized that they were naked. Were they naked or were they naked? Do you know the difference? Do you know Louis? Are you familiar with Louis Grizzard? Okay, Louis Grizzard. I love his definition. He says, okay, naked means you ain't got no clothes on. Naked means you ain't got no clothes on and you're up to no good. So were they naked or naked? So indeed, figs were the first plant that was mentioned by name in the Bible. The species is Ficus carica. The Hebrew is teon. The Greek is suke. I also want my students to know the plant family that these plants are a member of. They're a member of the Moraceae, or the mulberry family. And I think it's important because a lot of times, especially when we're dealing with plants that students aren't familiar with, if we can come up with another member of that family that they can associate with, it makes it easier to have an appreciation for that plant and the plant characteristics. So I always give the plant family, and then I try to give some example members of that family. Like figs are very closely, they're in the same family, closely related to rubber trees, breadfruit, osage, orange. It's not a really large family. There's only about 1,100 species in the family. But mulberries are a member of this family. And the reason I bring this up is because it kind of emphasizes my talk about how it's important to know the Greek and the Hebrew. The Greek for fig is suke. The Greek for mulberry is Moraceae. There's another plant in the Bible that is mentioned that we know the Greek. It is Sycamore. Sycamore. Does that sound familiar to you? Sycamore, absolutely right. And that is the plant reference that is an excellent descriptor of the plant in the Bible. It's not what we think of. When we think of a sycamore, you think of a very large deciduous tree that has very flat leaves with a lot of pubescence, a lot of hair on the backside, and sometimes some very attractive bark. That's what we think of as a sycamore tree. That's not the sycamore tree that's in the Bible. The sycamore tree in the Bible is very closely to the sycamore. The sycamore fig is the actual sycamore tree that's mentioned in the Bible. That's the tree that Lazarus climbed up to see Jesus when he was in Jericho. It wasn't a sycamore tree like we have here. It was a sycamore fig, very closely related to the common fig, and it even has fruit that are edible. So again, sometimes going back to the original Greek and the Hebrew is very invaluable. So my students will say, why are you making me learn this? Why are you even bringing it up? That's why. It helps. It really does. And there's a lot of figs and uses of figs today as well as in the past. There's a lot of fresh fruit uses of figs. This has been a great year for figs in my household. We've had tons of them. And so I dried some for you, and I'll pass some around because I find that audiences are much more receptive if they're munching on something. So I'm going to pass these around and let you folks have some dried figs. But figs were extremely important as a food source, definitely in biblical times, and this is absolutely why. And it's the fact that I can carry a whole lot of protein, calories, nutrition in a bag that's lightweight. And what else does drying do? Preserve. No refrigerators. You know, you were a nomadic type of people. You relied very heavily on things that you could dry down and preserve and carry easily. So dried materials were extremely important. And I also argue with my students, I say, and that's another reason that wine was so important, because there are a lot, we don't usually associate calories with wine, but wine is an effective way of containing and storing calories in a preserved manner that you can carry. It's a little heavy, but it does preserve calories in a safe way to not have a lot of pathogens in them from contamination. So figs, they were especially important fresh as well as dry, and also they were dried and they were packed together as cakes. So when you see cakes referenced in the Bible, they talk about cakes of figs and cakes of dates. It's not a baked cake that had figs in it or a baked cake that had dates in it. It was literally dried figs that were pressed together into a cake or a clump. The same with dates. So just to clarify that, when you see the cakes of dates, that's what or figs, that's what they're talking about. There's also examples of medicinal uses of figs in the Bible. It used as a purgative. Does anyone know what a purgative is? It's a really nice word, isn't it? Isn't it a delicate way to say a laxative? So, and vermifuge. Doesn't that sound? That sounds very nice. It's a lot better than say it was a dewormer. It's something that we use to get rid of worms. But there is documentation that figs were used as a purgative and as a vermifuge. It's also used to control warts and a poultice on tumors. And I'll show a biblical scripture example of that here in just a second. And clothing. In our previous slide, we know that figs were used in the Bible as clothing. Adam and Eve used it. How many of you ever picked figs before? Isn't it fun to rub up against fig leaves? No. And first of all, they've got all that fuzzy hair on the back. Many people have a very severe reaction to the hairs on figs. It's real itchy. The other thing is there's this white latex that's on figs when you peel off the fruit or the leaves, and it's kind of sticky, and that can be an irritant too. So, folks, I'm no style baron, but I'm assuming that there was probably not very much to choose from in the Garden of Eden, and that's why Adam and Eve decided to settle on fig leaves. But I think I'd look harder before I would wear a loincloth made out of fig leaves, because it wouldn't be the most comfortable clothing in the world, but it is what it is, right? Okay, so the example of a medicinal use of a plant, figs as a medicinal use is in 2 Kings, and this is when Hezekiah had displeasured God, and God had decided that it was the time for Hezekiah, and then Hezekiah petitions and says, please reconsider. In those days, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, came to him and said to him, thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die. You shall not recover. Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. Remember now, O Lord, I implore you, how I have walked before with you in faithfulness with a whole heart and have done what is good in your sight. Hezekiah wept bitterly before Isaiah had gone out of the middle court. The word of the Lord came to him. He said, turn back, say to Hezekiah, prince of my people, thus says the Lord, the God of your ancestor David, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Indeed, I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of the Lord. I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Then Isaiah said, bring a lump of figs. Let them take it and apply it to the boil so that he may recover. So we have documentation of them having medicinal properties. And incidentally, if you are interested in medicinal plants and the uses of medicinal plants, I believe on the back of the one reference, on one of the handouts, is a list of suggested readings and references. And probably the best book there is, I know it's the best author, is a guy named J.A. Duke. And there's two here that I have referenced. One is Herbs of the Bible. The other one is Duke's Handbook of Medicinal Plants of the Bible. He also has just a Medicinal Plants of the World. He's an excellent source if you're into medicinal plants and medicinal uses. You can't go wrong. I brought some books, incidentally, if you want to take a look at them and thumb through them. Many of the books that I have on that handout are up here up front. Feel free to thumb through them. I've given some comments on the handout. Some of them are really good. Some of them are extremely overpriced. There's one of them that's real thin by Musselman, which is a great book, but I don't think it's worth $120. But Anyway, so enough said about medicinal uses of plants. There's a lot of other examples in the Bible, and unfortunately, we won't be able to even touch on it. Okay, so we know the first plant that was the first plant reference in the Bible. We know the first plant mentioned by name. What is the last plant mentioned by name in the Bible? In other words, there's certain plants that appear over and over, like figs appear over and over in the Bible. But the last plant that we're introduced to by name is this particular plant. It's a tree. Here you can see it growing, and here's a close-up. And this particular plant is called citron wood or thiene wood. That is its common name. And the reference is in Revelation 18:12. Another reason to worry about common names, you know, we talked about sycamore and how that changes and how that's not the sycamore that I'm used to. The same when I see the word citron, citron wood. When I think of citron, I think of growing up and helping my mother make fruitcake. And this to me is citron. And if any of you are not familiar with citron, this is what I think of as citron. And actually, citron is a biblical plant. Did you know that citron is actually mentioned in the Bible, and it is used even today in Hebrew in the celebration of Sukkot, the festival of booths in the fall? They always have an etrog, which is what citron is. An etrog is closely related to a lemon, and that's what citron is. It's closely related to a lemon. And citron, what I'm passing around, is candied rind of this really bitter fruit. And in the biblical sense, in the festival of Sukkot, they carry the etrog around with them and use it in the ceremony of festival of the booths. So it is still important today. And so it's kind of ironic to me that citron that I think of is also a biblical plant. That's not what they're talking about here. This is different. This is Tetraclinus articulata, in case you really wanted to know. But look at it. Doesn't it look kind of familiar? Does it look like a plant you're familiar with? What does it look like to you? Yeah, it looks like a juniper, and you're absolutely right. And again, that's another reason I make my students learn the plant family's name. It is exactly in the Cupressaceae family, which is the juniper family. So it's closely related to eastern red cedar and all the other junipers, and it even looks like it. And so, again, that's the way I can get my students to associate it with it. So here's the biblical passage. And it talks about the use of citron wood in the Bible. This particular passage is entitled "Woe to Babylon." This is a prediction in Revelation of what's going to happen in the end times, and it's about how Babylon is going to be torn apart, torn asunder, and will be no more. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, and her is the Babylon, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, fine linen, and by linen they're talking about flax linen, it's a plant base, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, so there we have it, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh, and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, and carriages, and the bodies and souls of men. So even in this one little passage, look how many plant references there are, and how much importance there was in terms of trade for these plants. You know, linen is a plant product, citron wood, and we have cinnamon and spices, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oils, flour, and wheat. So, incidentally, what is citron wood? It's a very fine, fragrant wood. It was important in trade. We know they wouldn't have mentioned it. It's actually originally probably from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco all the way over to Algeria, Tunisia, and the island of Malta. It's actually the national tree of Malta. So it's still extant today as a tree. It's not something that's obscure. We know what it is. So that's the last plant that's mentioned by name. What's the last plant reference that's mentioned in the Bible? And the last plant reference in the Bible is Revelation 22:19. And interestingly, it's one that we were introduced to way back in Genesis. Once again, we have a reference to the tree of life. And so the scripture passage is a warning against changing any of the texts in the book of Revelation. And so here's the passage, and it talks about the tree of life. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds anything to them, God will add to him the plagues described in this book. And if anyone takes words away from this book of prophecy, God will take away from him his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. And if you recall, Revelation is not a real fun one to read. There's a lot of plagues in there I wouldn't want to have happen to me. So again, it's a great warning. But this is the last reference to plants that we have in the Bible. So from Genesis all the way to Revelation, and then all the way in between, we're just full of plant references. There's different ways to try to categorize plants that are mentioned in the Bible. I talked about the uses of the plant or how they appeared in Scripture. Another way that I think is useful is to talk about categories of plants. And so I've tried to categorize into 3 categories of plants that we're exposed to in the Bible. The first one are native plants. And so this would be, when we talk about the town of Bethany, it's a house of dates. So it's probably near a grove of dates. And that's a native, well actually dates are not native plant, but it's a plant that is in that area. The other group is plants that are cultivated in agriculture, and dates, indeed, I misspoke, I apologize. Dates are not native to Palestine, they're actually native to the oases of Egypt, but they were certainly cultivated in Palestine, and they were grown in groves in low water areas, in lowland areas that had water, like oases. And so that's another category of plants, the plants that were cultivated in agriculture and were grown in that area, that not necessarily native to that area. And then thirdly, we have a group of plants and or plant products that were imported from far, far away. And so I want to give some examples of this from plants in the Bible. The first one is a native plant, and these are the cedars of Lebanon. The species is Cedrus labani. The Hebrew is Arez ha-Lebonon. The Greek is Kedros Lebanov, and the family is Pinaceae, or the pine family. It's really a small family of plants, only 210 species, only 11 genera, and that includes members of the pine genus, spruce trees, fir trees, hemlocks, and Doug firs. Those are all example members of this particular family. It's a gorgeous tree, isn't it? Very old plant. It has when it's younger, it grows straight and makes great lumber, but as it gets older, it has a tendency to top off, to lose its main shoot, and so you get this kind of topping off. Here's another example of growing in the mountains of Lebanon. And it was used, very important, for building of ships and for buildings themselves, as well as for furniture. And probably the best example of buildings is, remember that when Solomon built, and I've got some actual pieces of cedar of Lebanon, if you've never seen it, if you want to pass that around, you can feel the wood. Very nice green wood, easy to work with, easy to split. When Solomon had the temple built, he used cedars of Lebanon as a major component of the temple. And if you go to Exodus, you can read that particular passage. But I want you to have an appreciation of what did it take for them to get that lumber to Jerusalem. They're coming from Lebanon, and so if we imagine we're looking at a map, here would be Israel, and then Lebanon is on the north. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. So they're growing up in the mountains of Lebanon. So what they had to do was harvest. Hiram was the king or the ruler of Lebanon at that time. He had workers cut down the trees in the mountains. They had to transport the trees over to the Mediterranean Sea. Then they floated them down the coast and then brought them back up, probably in Tyre or one of those coastal towns of Israel, and then brought up into the mountainous region of Jerusalem. So think of that tract of land to get lumber. They had to go to a lot of effort to build the temple, and that's where they came from. These are mountains in Lebanon, and so again, I just wanted you to have an appreciation for that. They were it was prized for high quality fragrant wood and extremely resistant to decay. Here's another shot of cedars of Lebanon, just a really elegant tree. I'm not going to go through all these particular passages just for the sake of time, but suffice it to say that there are a lot of passages that deal with cedars of Lebanon that are in Scripture. I already mentioned Bethany, and so you're familiar with that means house of dates, but I did want to talk a little bit about other uses of dates in the Bible. The species is Phoenix dactylifera. Oh, and by the way, dates is an example of an agriculturally important plant that was not native to the area, but it was certainly cultivated extensively in Palestine, in that area. And so Phoenix dactylifera. Tamar is the Hebrew name for it. And there are also some famous people named Tamar in the Bible that have that as a common name. So whenever you read of someone named Tamar in the Bible, now you know who they are. Some of them have some sad stories. Some of them have happy stories associated with that name. But you'll know that they're named after a date palm. Phoenix is the Greek. It's in the Eriacaceae family, which is the palm family. About 2,000 species, all palms. That's all that there are members of it, like the coconut palm, sago palm, palmettos, and windmill palms, which incidentally will grow in this part of it. Well, I don't think it'll grow this far north, but in the Piedmont, windmill palms will grow naturally. Important fruit. The importance of dates. It was definitely important as a fresh fruit and as a dried fruit. It was one of the 7 species mentioned in Deuteronomy, and I'll show you this passage here in a minute. But you're probably familiar with the promised land, the land of milk and honey, and then there's a list of plants that they would have in an abundance when they came to the promised land. And dates are one of them that's mentioned, and you probably don't realize it because it's the last word in that particular passage. I'll go ahead and read the passage. The passage is Deuteronomy 8:8. The description is the land of milk and honey. So you will inherit a land with wheat and barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and the last one is honey. And when they talk about honey, in our minds, you're probably thinking honey from a comb. And that's not true in this particular passage. And when you see the word honey by itself in the Bible, in many cases, it may be this honey that comes from dates rather than honey from the comb. There are passages that specifically say in the Bible, as sweet as honey and as honey from the comb, those are two different things, two different critters. Honey from the comb is honey made by bees, made by insects. Honey by itself is probably a sweet syrup that's made by expressing the liquid out of a date and then kind of letting it dry down into this concentrated liquid. And then of course they would make a liqueur out of that too, which is another way to conserve calories and carry it around in a preserved fashion. So not only was it important as a fresh fruit and a dried fruit, it was one of the 7 species. It was the honey that's mentioned in this particular Deuteronomy passage. They used the fronds for covering roofs. The trees, they didn't last very long as timber. They would grind up the forage, use it for animal feed. They would express oil out of the seed. They'd make jewelry out of the seeds of dates, ropes out of the fibers, mats out of the fibers, baskets were woven out of the fibers, as I mentioned, made out of liqueur. There's also a documentation that it was believed at that particular time, it's been disproven, that date seeds, that's what I'm holding here, were a fertility drug, that if you were grind up and ingest date seeds, that would increase your fertility and increase childbearing. Duke doesn't he discounts that, but we do have documentation that was a belief. And palms are used today in religious ceremonies, and they were used in biblical times in religious ceremonies as well. Just wanted to show you, if you've never seen dates before they've been harvested, they're very large clusters, and these aren't quite ripe yet. And as I mentioned, there is a pit in each one of these dates. Sometimes when we get them in the box, the pits aren't there. If you can ever get fresh dates with the pit still in them, they're so much better than the things that they put in the package. They're just some wonderful dates. There's many different types of dates, and they all have different flavors. This is a market in Morocco, I think. And I wasn't there, but I had a friend that was just, I have to live vicariously. So I have friends that go and they come back and say, oh, you should have tasted these dates. They were great. And each one of them had a special flavor. Some of them were smoky, some of them tasted like honey, some of them tasted like apricots. So, date production, we're still producing a lot of dates today. This is 2013 statistics. The largest date producing country in the world is Egypt. So now you have your what'd you learn today, your gee whiz fact and figure to share. I always give one of those to my students because I say, okay, when you talk to your parents and they say, well, what'd you learn in school today? I'm paying a lot of money for you to be here. Okay, well, I found out that Egypt is the top producing country for dates. And so I said, all right, you're going to satisfy your parents are investing in your education. A little bit more about dates. They are native to the Saharan desert. There are dioecious. I got to throw some science in, folks. We can't just have fun. What would be the use of just having fun? We have to learn some science too, right? And science is not fun, right? So, what's dioecious mean? Some of you, if you're a master gardener, you already know this. Dioecious means literally, the translation means two houses. And from a plant standpoint, what that means is we have male plants and we have female plants. And there's only female flowers on the female plants. There's only male flowers on the male plants. And what does that mean from a reproductive standpoint? You have to have both. If you want date fruit, you're going to have a male date tree, and you're going to have a female date tree. Okay, very good. So the male plants were important because they were pollinators. And that's all they were good for is pollen, which, I think there's some people that have that perspective of males today. That's all we're good for. And you had to have female plants. They're the important ones. They're the ones that bear the fruit. They're the ones that we want to have the majority of if we have an orchard of date palms, because they're the fruit bearers. There's another couple reasons to know about dioecious, and here's a good common practical example of knowing if you're dealing with a dioecious plant. Ginkgos are dioecious, okay? You never want to plant a female ginkgo tree in your yard. Do you know why? They make fruit, and the fruit smells. The fruit emit butyric acid. Do you know what butyric acid is? Well, it happens to be the acid that's in your stomach, and so when you have an upset stomach, that smell, that taste, that's butyric acid, and that's what your shoes are going to smell like if you stomp on the fruit or your kids stomp on it and then walk into your house. So never plant a female ginkgo. Only plant the male ginkgos. You get the beautiful foliage, but you don't have the nasty fruit. So in this case, with with dates, we need them both. And here's an example of a date grove. First, I wanted to point out, these are dates drying in the front on mats, and so they're usually handled right there. Okay, so we're looking at an orchard of date palms. You're a date producer. What do you think the majority of these trees are, their sex? Which? Female. You only need enough males to pollinate all the females, so it's about a 1 to 20, between 1 to 10, 1 to 20 ratio. So about every 10th or 20th tree is going to be male. They just take up space and then they give pollen. The female tree is the important one. So if you're going to go out and plant a grove of dates, are you going to plant a bunch of seed and wait for 15 years to see whether it's male or female? No. So how do you know whether you have male or female plants or not? Or how can you assure what sex is of the plants that you have in your grove? You got to do what's called asexual propagation. It's like we take cuttings of plants and we root them. Probably done that with ivy is a good example. The same holds true for date palms. Look at the base of some of these palm trees. You see these little pups that are coming off the side? That's the way that they reproduce date palms agriculturally. So they'll dig those up and then plant them by themselves. They'll cut off that little side shoot and then that'll form a brand new plant. And since this plant was female, we know that that side branch is also going to be female. So that's going to be a wonderful way to ensure that we've got female plants. And also, if we've got a really good producing palm, we're gonna take all the pups from it. We want to select for the best, right? The best cultivation. So a little bit about horticulture as well as botany. You know the word dioecious. The rulers and the conquering tribes during biblical times were also very aware of dioeciousness, and so they used a lot of that knowledge when they were trying to conquer people. If you wanted to conquer somebody, you wanted to really knock them out, and you'd probably want to take away their food source. So they took advantage of that. So when they took over an area and took over a tribe, and they knew they were going to leave, but they wanted to leave the people devastated, they didn't have to cut down this entire palm grove. All they had to cut down was what? The males, absolutely. You wipe out all the males, and they had to wait for 10 years, 15 years for that male palm to grow up and pollinate the rest. And in the meantime, all these females are there not producing any fruit. So people used plants and plant knowledge in every aspect of life, even when they would conquer other tribes. And so date palms are a good example of how they use that knowledge. So, a couple passages about dates quickly before we move on to another plant. This is a good example of symbolic representation. This is where a palm tree is representing an upstanding or a righteous person. And this is in Psalm 92. The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar of Lebanon. Another plant reference. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. In old age, they will still produce fruit. They are always green and full of sap. So here's an example of symbolic representation of a plant in Scripture. Now, I mentioned about the use of plants in ceremonies when I talked about the etrog, the citron, and how it was important in Sukkot, the festival of booths. Well, palms were also used in that particular celebration, and they're still used today by some Jews. If they celebrate festival of the booths, they will actually go out and build a booth according to these instructions in Leviticus. So what we have here is the instructions on how to have this festival, how to hold the festival. On the first day of the festival, you shall take the fruit of majestic trees. That's the etrog. That's the citron that we talked about, that I passed around. That's the fruit of the majestic trees. Branches of palm trees, and they're talking about date palm. Boughs of leafy trees, probably myrtle trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You shall keep it as a festival of the Lord 7 days in the year. You shall keep it in the 7th month as a statute forever throughout your generations. It's a fall festival. You shall live in booths for 7 days. All that citizens in Israel shall live in booths, so that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So here is an example of a plant being used as part of a religious ceremony. They would build this booth and live in it for 7 days in remembrance as part of this festival. Now, can you think of a Christian use of palms for a religious ceremony? Palm Sunday, right, which is based on when Jesus first entered Jerusalem. And we have a reference of that when Jesus entered Jerusalem in John. But before I read this, I want you to realize that this was not something that they just invented on the fly, like, hey, we're going to wave palm branches since this important person is coming in. It had been used for years and years and years by the Hebrews for celebrations. And probably the first documentation I could find of use was during the time that Antiochus, who was a Seleucid king over the Middle East, so he's originally of Greek origin, when they invaded Jerusalem in 200 BC, sometime in that time period, they took over the temple and they defaced the temple, and they were finally chased out of the temple and chased out of Jerusalem in 165 during the Maccabean revolution when they revolted. And they waved palms whenever they chased them out and they were in celebration. So this Palm Sunday was quite common. It was that was used in celebration, not only for Jesus' entry, but also for a lot of celebrations. So here is the use of palms and Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." So again, another example of use of plants in religious ceremonies or in social celebrations. An example of a plant that's from far away that was very important is frankincense, and it's actually native to Oman over here. And so, here, take a piece. If you want a piece of frankincense, please have one. Take it with you. Take it home. So frankincense is a really unique tree. It's kind of a scrubby-looking thing. If any of you ever been to the desert Southwest or even Texas, you've seen mesquite trees. It looks a lot like mesquite. It's not the same family. The Hebrew is Lebona. The Greek is Lebanos, and you'll notice there's a lot of similarities in many cases. That's because the Greeks simply tried to translate the Hebrew from when they came into the area. It's in the Burseraceae family, which is a real obscure family. I don't expect you to be familiar with any of these. There's only 550 species. The gumbo limbo, which is from the Caribbean, is a member of that family, as well as myrrh, which is another biblical plant, and then the balm tree, which is probably the balm of Gilead, came from this particular species of plant. So very fragrant plant material. It was burned as incense, and you can still buy incense today that's made out of frankincense. There's little cubes of incense in this packet. If you want to take a look, you can open it up and take little cones of incense. That one's actually a blend. I think there's some myrrh in it as well. So it was used as incense. It was used in perfumes. The Egyptians used it in embalming. Hebrews did not embalm. They would prepare bodies for burial, but there was no embalming. Embalming involves cutting open and taking out organs and placing them in separate containers. Hebrews did not do that. The Egyptians did, and then they would backfill into that cavity with herbs and fragrances like frankincense. So what is frankincense? I mean, you're holding a piece of it. We know it comes from this tree, but I haven't told you what it is yet. It's sap, exactly. It's dried rosin. And so what this gentleman is doing is he's cutting a slit, and he's going to put a little container to catch the dripping, similar to if you were to try to make real maple syrup. It's you collect the sap, you dry it down. So that's what frankincense is. It's the rosin from a tree, and it was highly prized during biblical times. It's very fragrant. And here's an example of a scripture passage that's using the frankincense as part of an offering, a sacrificial offering, and it's a grain offering. When someone brings a grain offering to the Lord, his offering is to be a fine flour. He is to pour oil on it, put incense, and it's frankincense here, on it, and take it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest shall take a handful of fine flour and oil, olive oil we're sure, together with all the incense, and burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, an offering made of fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Here's an example of a plant product being a component of a burned incense, a burned grain offering that would have been given in the temple. Actually, in Leviticus, it probably wouldn't have been in the temple, definitely would have been in the tabernacle, not the temple. Another generation or two later. Here's another example of frankincense appearing in Scripture. This is in the New Testament, and this is when it was brought as a gift. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, I've given you the frankincense, so here's your myrrh. And myrrh is also a rosin from a tree, and that's it, folks. No gold. Sorry. You'll have to go down to Dahlonega and pan your own. But yeah, and myrrh is interesting. It's a lot different fragrance to it, but it was also important. I know we're not going to have time to get to it, but that's okay. There's so many plants. I could talk forever on this. So here we have an example of frankincense. And incidentally, the word frankincense, the word itself has got an interesting story behind it. It comes from the fact that during the Crusades, there were knights that were from France and from Germany, and some of them were Franks, which is a group of people. And they traveled to the Mideast, and they were introduced and exposed to the culture and to the products of this area. And then they brought them back to Europe with them. And so it was the Franks that brought this incense back with them and introduced Europe to it. So that's how it got its name of frankincense in our language today, is because the Franks were the ones that brought this incense back. So that's the etymology of, see now you, another little tidbit, knowledge nugget that you've got, the etymology of frankincense. Now you know. Okay, let's go back to our original list of questions. How many plants are listed in the Bible? How many independent species of plants do you think there are mentioned in the Bible? Anybody think there's 25? How about 50? How about 100? How about 200? 200? Somewhere in between 100 and 200 is probably the best guess we have. We don't know for sure because it's unclear, or common descriptions and common names, such as thorns. There's a description of thorns. Remember the grass in the Genesis? We don't know, if that particular species of grass is the same species of grass the next time we hear the word grass mentioned in Scripture. So we're not sure, but biblical botanists believe the range is somewhere between 110 and 230. Zohari is a real good source. He was a professor at the University of Jerusalem. He's down near the 110 level, and he's much more conservative on his plants. I like his number a little better. The 220 comes from Moldinki, and Moldinki, this guy and his wife did this book in the turn of the century, and they really did extensive work. Not only does he list plants that we think of the higher order of plants, but he also lists things like molds. There's a lot of references to mold growing on walls in the Bible, and also talks about the leavening. We're going to talk about leavening here in just a minute, used in making of bread. And those, he's right, those can be considered plants. Yeast can be considered plants if you want to. So he's got upwards of 220, and he gives you every description in the world about it. And so if you ever have insomnia, this is a good one for that. It will cure it. So I can highly recommend Moldinki's book. He's very thorough. So that's how many plants are mentioned in the Bible, probably independent species. That's a lot of plants, folks. That's a lot of different plants. So what are the most mentioned plants in the Bible? And the ones that appear the most common or most often. And so I'll just give you the top 5. Figs come in 5th place. There are over 60 references to figs, fig cakes, fig trees, fig leaves in the Bible. Flax, which is not one that we commonly think of today, appears over 250 times, mainly as linen, but there's also the fiber flax, like there was a, well, I'll get to that. So flax is another example of a plant, over 250 times that are mentioned in the Bible. Olives is the 3rd. Olive tree, olive oil, the process of anointing, which definitely utilized olive oil in a religious ceremony. There's over 350 references to olives in the Bible. Grapes comes in 2nd place. The fruit of grapes, vines, vineyards, wines, etc. Over 500 references. But by far, the greatest leader is by far wheat. References to wheat. There's over 800 references to wheat. Bread, thresh, grain, meal, etc. And so the other handout that I've given you is what I produce a plant sheet for my class for every one of the species that we go over. I've given you the plant sheet for wheat. And so you can see that I've given you the species for wheat. And then I've given you the Hebrew, I've given you the Greek and the name of the family, and then I try to give a little background on what were the main uses of wheat during this particular biblical time, if it's used today, that sort of thing, and then what are its uses today. So there's a lot of information, and then I give a list for every one of the plants I've gone through. I give some example references if you want to see some different examples from Scripture, and just do some quick referencing. And then I list each type of plant reference that deals with wheat. For example, the first one on your list is bread. Okay, everyone see bread about halfway down? There are 286 references to bread. And then I list out every place in Scripture, starting with Genesis. So you see bread appears Genesis 3:19 and 14:18, etc., etc. That's where you can read this all the way through the end of the Bible. And then you can come down and see the next reference in terms of number of times it appears is grain. There's 227 times that grains appear, and then I list all that. And then you can flip over on the back and you can go through and see how many times flour appears, threshing, wheat by itself, loaves, etc., etc. So that's what that information is for. So if you really want to research and read all the Scripture passages on wheat, you got it right here on your sheet. You can knock yourself out and do it. There's a lot of them. But I do that for all the plants that I've researched, and to me it brings to mind just how much the reference there are to plants in the Bible, and how important they were to society in that time period. So wheat. There's a couple of different species of wheat: Triticum durum and Triticum aestivum, and also an older emmer wheat, which was replaced pretty quickly with the modern. We're talking about 2000 BC, modern times type of wheat. Emmer wheat is probably the oldest that was ever used in civilization, and the reason it was quickly rejected, or these others were adopted, is the fact that it was the durum and the aestivum are much more free threshing than emmer wheat, which means that the outer hull of the wheat, the hulls, stuck to it, and so you had to beat it harder to remove the grain from the outer part that you didn't want to eat. And so if you had one that broke away easier, it was easier to separate the grain, which was more desirable. You had less labor involved. So emmer was not that important as the durum and aestivum became more and more popular, and they had better varieties. The Hebrew for wheat is chita. The Greek is sitos. They both mean wheat. The family is Poaceae, which is a grass family. Over 10,000 species. It's one of our largest families. Rice, corn, bamboo, Bermuda grass, and oats are all example members. It was a main field crop of biblical times. It was also used in religious ceremonies. There was an anointing of the priests where they utilized grains. We already saw an example of a sacrificial offering utilizing wheat. The straw was used for fodder, for bedding, thatch, making of bricks. In the book of Exodus, we're introduced to that. It's still a major grain crop worldwide. A couple things about wheat. I'm going to spend a little time on wheat because it was so important in this particular society. This is wheat that has already been threshed and winnowed. These are the individual roasted grains of wheat, and on the other side is wheat that still has the hulls or the bracts that are attached to the grain, and so you had to remove this outer part before you grind. You didn't want to grind up all this papery outer stuff. It's just too much. It's not good in flour, so you have to remove that dry. It's like the strings in celery. It really doesn't do much for you. So you got to get rid of it and just concentrate on the grain. So what they would do is they would have what's called parched grain, and there are references to parched or roasted green grain. And you can still purchase this today. Freca or Farrick or these products. You can buy cracked Freca, and what it is, it's parched grain. Rather than going through all the trouble of threshing and removing these husks by hand, what they would do is they would burn off the outer husk, and then you'd have this kind of parched, smoky flavored material. That's what freca is. It's cracked freca. So they wouldn't go through the winnowing, the threshing winnowing process. They would just burn it off, and then they would eat it as it is. raw green, or they would cook it into a porridge. But you can still purchase freckle today. It's got a real pleasant kind of a smoky flavor because it is it was burned off. You could grind it into flour for bread was another use. You could parboil it and then crack it, and that was a way to help preserve it. When you parboiled it, apparently it was easier to keep it from going rancid than just whole grain. And so if you had more than you could make bread out of, they would parboil it and crack it. And that's what bulgur wheat is today. It is wheat that has been parboiled and then re-dried. And so, if you want to see what bulgur wheat is, a little bit different. So I'll pass that one around over here. And so all these products are extremely important. Here's the actual process of roasting green grain. This is in Syria. Yes, they're making freckle in Syria. And so they're burning off and this is really nice. They didn't even have to take the stalks off. They're just burning it all, and then they're going to collect the grain from these heads. It'll all burn off. And then there's your burnt green grain, and that's what freckle is before they crack it. And that was a product, and it's still used today. Now, if you wanted to process it and grind it into flour, you had to separate the grain from the chaff, the kernels and the chaff. And so you first had to go through a threshing process to try to remove that outer portion. And today there's a lot of different methods here. They're using these thatch clumps to beat the grain out of this combination of the stalks and then the outer hulls. And then you do what's called winnowing, and winnowing is the smaller outer hull husk will float away and the heavier grain will fall straight down, and so you're separating through the process of winnowing. And so you'll see the references in the Bible to winnowing, and if you have never seen it or you don't understand it, it's a separation process. So when they talk about winnowing in the Bible, they're talking about separating two different things. Just for your own edification, China produces more wheat than any other country, and India is second. We're right here in the middle in terms of the 5 most important wheat producing countries in the world. So got to throw some economics in there too for those of you that aren't from a plant background. A couple of scripture references here with wheat before we move on. The symbolic representation, this is a great example. This is from Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. So here's a great example of symbolic representation of healthy years of good harvest, and then spindly grain heads indicating the 7 bad years of probably drought and very little harvest at all. So here's an excellent example of symbolic representation. The use of grain in religious ceremonies. We've already had an example of use in a sacrificial offering. This is a consecration of a priest. Whenever a priest was consecrated, they had to follow this procedure. So this is what you are to do to consecrate them. You are to, so that they may serve me as a priest. Take a young bull and 2 rams without defect, and from fine wheat flour without yeast, make bread and cakes, mixed with oil and wafers, spread the oil, put them on a basket and present them in it along with the bull and the 2 rams. So this process wasn't a sacrifice. It was a religious ceremony process of anointing / consecrating a priest, and it involved the use of grain. We've already had an example of a sacrificial offering earlier, so I will skip that one. And I wanted to get on and talk a little bit about bread before I run out of time here. And this is another example of symbolic representation that I don't think we in society appreciate just the impact that Jesus' statement would have had on the members of the folks that heard him. But this is Jesus talking to a group, and he's telling them that he is the bread of life. So Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, manna. It is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they declared, from now on, give us this bread. Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. In our society today, this probably doesn't have the same impact or relative importance, just from a survival standpoint, as it did during biblical times. You have to realize that in biblical times, Hebrews and most of the tribes and peoples that lived in the Middle East relied extremely heavy on breads. They would have bread at every meal of the day. As a matter of fact, when our nutritionists look at the diet and the eating patterns of people from biblical times, it's estimated that upwards of 60 to 75% of the caloric intake of people during that time came from bread. So when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, they paid attention. That has a lot of impact. There's a lot of importance to that. And we today, I don't think, realize what he's saying. We don't have that association with bread anymore. I don't think we rely that heavily on bread for our caloric intake today. As a matter of fact, we're trying to shun carbs. We're trying to get away from bread. But I really try to stress this to my students, that not only do you have to look at the scripture and you have to look at the plants, but you also have to have an appreciation of what's going on in society. What do they eat? Where do they live? What do they do? And this is, to me, a great an example of the impact of scripture that might be lost if we didn't know the whole story. So with that, I wanted to talk real quickly here on bread, because since bread is so important, I think we need to have an appreciation for what was bread like in biblical times. It probably isn't like what we think of when we think of and have bread today. I can assure you that we don't eat bread on a daily basis the way that they ate bread. It wouldn't taste the same, it wouldn't look the same. It was probably a lot healthier back then than it is today, because it was going to be a whole wheat product, a whole grain product, or whole barley. They didn't separate it, they didn't bleach their flour, they kept the fiber in there, they kept the protein or the germ, the wheat germ in there. They didn't separate it out and then sell it to us as a food supplement that cost us more than if they just left it in there alone and given it to us up front. It would have all been blended together. So, and it wouldn't have tasted the same, because the process of baking bread was much different, and the leavening agent was a lot different at that point in time. So I want to talk a little bit about bread. And there's a third page to this wheat handout that kind of summarizes what I'm going to talk about, plus a lot more information I won't have time to get into. The two main grains that were used for bread were barley and wheat. Barley was considered to be more of the poor man's bread source, and the main reason was because it would grow on more marginal soils. It would take less water, it could grow on less fertile land. Wheat required more water and required higher levels of soil fertility to get a good crop of wheat, and it took more care. The upside to wheat, it cost more probably, but it was also a higher quality protein, higher quality grain, and more calories per unit weight than barley bread. So that's the reason that barley bread was considered to be of lower quality. It was, and it is today. They had leavened and unleavened bread, either by intent or non-intent, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And so I want to make a couple comments about what would bread look like. First of all, there's some references in some translations of the Bible that talk about yeast of the Pharisees. That's really a bad translation. They wouldn't have had pure yeast during this time period. The better translation, the better word to think about is leavening. And leavening is used in the Bible as well. That's a much more accurate description of what people used to make their bread. They didn't have a pure yeast. We didn't have the scientific ability to separate out a single species of baker's yeast until the 1800s. Before that, it was kind of hit or miss, and you could have your quote baker's yeast contaminated and over time. And so in biblical times, they probably relied on a sourdough leavening agent. It's not probably, definitely. It was just a natural airborne type of leavening agent that you would collect, and you would keep that starter, that leavening agent. And you remember during the Passover, they didn't have time for their bread to rise. They had to eat unleavened bread, but they took their leavening agent with them when they left Egypt. And so I want you to be aware of that means the whole basis of bread baking back then was a sourdough. And so I want you to understand that, because it gives a completely different flavor and texture, because it doesn't rise as much as our really fluffy baker's yeast. So I've made you this is whole wheat, it's like a flatbread, but it is, and I made it, if you're ever into sourdoughs, it's really cool. You can buy sourdough starter, and what they do is they go out and they collect the bacteria, and they collect the fungi from different regions. These were made with a sourdough starter that was collected in Giza, which is as close as I could find to Palestine. So it's as authentic as we can get, folks. But take a piece if you want, tear off a piece. And this is a good example of a flatbread and what it would taste like. You can smell the sourness that comes from it because there's lactobacillus, which is a bacteria, as well as the different strains of fungi. And again, I'm not going to go into it, but you got a lot more information on your handout. So I want you to be aware of and appreciate it. The other thing that I want you to be aware of is when they talk about leavened bread, it had to have wheat in it. This is a sourdough whole wheat loaf of bread that I baked. I asked you not to, you can pass it around, but please don't open it and cut it, but you can feel how dense it is. But it has risen. I mean, and there are air holes and air pockets in it because the leavening agent will work on it. If you have barley, 100% barley flour, the yeast and the bacteria will ferment that flour when you add water. They will ferment it. The problem is the quality of barley is so poor. There's such a small amount of protein in it that the bread dough can't collect and can't capture those air bubbles. So the process of fermentation, the way bread rises is these microorganisms give off CO2, and then the CO2 is trying to escape. Well, think of the protein, mainly gluten, that's in wheat flour as trapping those air bubbles. Think of it as kind of like chewing gum or bubble gum. And so when the air expands from this fermentation process, it can't escape. It's trapped by this sticky protein. Those proteins are absent in barley. There's a little bit in here, and it will rise to a small degree, but it won't rise to the same degree. This loaf of barley bread was from the same recipe, the same starter, sourdough, but it's 100% barley flour. And again, I just want you to see how small, there's not very many, I'll pass it around, there's not very many air holes. It doesn't rise. Barley flour does not leaven, doesn't respond to the leavening agent very much. And so I just wanted to warn you about that. So when you see barley bread references, probably it wasn't, they probably didn't even bother putting the leavening agent in there. Now, if you want to taste some barley bread, I made another loaf of barley bread, and you can tear up yourself off a little piece and have it as a completely different flavor. And this, again, that's as leavened as it gets. It's like a brick, isn't it? So probably they would have been flatbreads that were non-leavened when you see barley bread. So when they talk about the loaves of bread, they were probably flat loaves rather than the nice round loaves that we're used to. So what did it look like? Probably would have been the flat loaves. This is a good example this is barley bread that was being cooked in Lebanon, right out of the oven. And they just kind of look clumpy. It kind of looks like a drop biscuit, They didn't have baking soda. They couldn't use that as a leavening agent or baking powder. So they were kind of, they still use today, this is cooking in what's called a taboon. And so this is an oven, the coals are in the bottom of this pit. And the way they cook is they would, I had another slide, but they stick the dough on the inside and then let it cook, and then they peel it off. The other way that they cook, and this picture is taken from the 1800s that's taken in Israel. They're making unleavened bread. They're spreading the dough over a metal zag. They wouldn't have used metal in biblical times. They could have used some pottery zags over the fire and cooked their flatbread like that. Here's a close-up of what the metal looks like in modern times. They're still using them. It's an iron plate. Here's this woman using in Lebanon. She's using a taboon, and she's placing. See how they place it on the inside? They just stick it right to the side. That's the way it bakes. And then they peel it off and they eat it. And then here's some barley cakes being cooked. This is a different type of oven. This is called a tanur. And the difference on a tanur is not only do you put coals on the inside, you put them in there first. You also put and build a fire on the outside. And the reason they thought this was better was because they would let the coals on the inside quit smoking, so you have less smoke on your bread as it's cooking, and then you would use the intense heat from the outside to warm your bread coming through this wall of pottery. So it's supposed to have less of a smoky, burnt flavor than if all your fire comes from the inside of the pit. So a lot of different ways, and you can still see these today. The last one I'm going to have time to talk about today, because I'm going to wear you out if I keep going. Is I really wanted to talk a little bit about grapes, and this is a picture from Israel today. This is a working vineyard in Israel, and I wanted to show a couple things to you. First of all, in Scripture, you may recall there's a couple stories about the keeper of a vineyard, and they talk about, I'm going to build a watchtower and look over my vineyard to protect it. And this is a watchtower in a vineyard. That's what that structure is. And I don't know the date of it, but it's pretty ancient. It's at least 500 years old. So that's one thing I wanted to point out, that watchtowers were used in vineyards and in orchards to protect not only from roaming animals, but also vagrants coming in and stealing. The other thing that I wanted to point out is not all grape production in Israel during the biblical times looks like our grape production today. We have very sophisticated trellising systems with guidelines or some kind of hard wooden trellis to train the vines to grow on. Those were used in Israel, we know, but the majority of them were probably just like this. You have the main trunk of the vine, and then the side laterals, which we would have trained on to become cordones, just growing, and then they grow along the ground. And so they would grow along the ground. And so obviously it's not the most efficient way, and you're not going to get as great fruit quality. But I want you to realize that not everything was grown then as we grow it now. And here's a good example. So quickly going through grapes. Vitis vinifera is the wine grape that they were growing. The Hebrew enab is grape, geffen is vine, and yayin is wine. Staphula is grape in Greek. Amphilos is vine, and oinos is wine in Greek. The first was Hebrew. It's the Vitaceae family, and they are related. Same family as Virginia creeper, are native muscadines, and then also Boston ivy. It was important during biblical times as a fruit, as well as a source of wine. And I don't think we have an appreciation. I talked about dried fruit and how important they are. And so I made you some raisins, and you have not, and these are really inferior to what I think raisins should taste like. What we buy as raisins are not really so great. These are a little better, but they're still not as good as taking grapes that would have been grown in that time period. So have some, open them up, yeah, eat some.
What kind of grapes?
They're a purple Tokai, and they're seedless, but they have a lot more flavor than the Thompson seedless. But I think the true raisins had much more flavor than this, but they would have had seed in them.
Do you know what type of grape, any type of grape you're familiar with today that is brewed during biblical times? Any ideas at all?
I haven't a clue. Yeah, like a particular cultivar. Yeah. They would have been red. We know that. They wouldn't have had white. Yeah. They weren't into oaken barrels. No Chardonnay. Good question. Good question. But yeah, we've lost all that. Yeah, we sure have. So grapes were important not only as a fresh fruit, but also dried. And remember why dried was important is because it allows you to preserve. And then same thing with wine. Wine was very important. Again, you might be surprised to know that China is the main grape producing country in the world today. And they produce a heck of a lot more than even Italy does. So there's a lot of scripture references to vines and branches. I'll just go over one here. Again, I think it's important, the first slide I showed you was the main trunk that's coming out of the ground, and then all the little side ones growing off. Those are going to be the fruit-bearing branches. We call those cordons whenever we have them trellised real nicely. And so this particular passage talks about how it's important to stay connected to God. It says, I am the true vine, and God is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. That's exactly what we do today. This is happening right now, even as we sit here. I was up at a vineyard on Wednesday and they were doing this. They've gone in the wintertime, they've pruned off the branches that they feel are going to be weak, that aren't going to produce any fruit. This is great symbolism based on horticultural vineyard management. So there are prunings that happen to eliminate non-producing. And then there's pruning that occurs on vines that are healthy, that are producing fruit. And yet, even those types of vines need pruning, because grapes produce too many leaves. We want this fruit to ripen. So they'll come into what's called leaf pulling. And so a vineyard owner will come in and pull off those leaves to allow sunlight to penetrate down, to ripen the fruit, to enrich it. So to me, this is just a beautiful example of a common horticultural practice and the equation about how followers of Christ become more fruitful if they're maintained, if they are watched by a gardener. There's really no reason to read the rest of this, but it's a great example of symbolic representation that's based on reality. It's based on what we do. Now, I do want to tell you this story, because this is a very important story. This is the first case. This is the first vineyard that was ever planted and documented in the Bible. It's the first documentation of wine in the Bible. It's the first documentation of somebody going on a drinking binge, and also the first documentation of someone having a hangover and doing something that they probably regretted later on. And that person was Noah. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and laid uncovered inside its tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Jephthah took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way, so they could not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out that his youngest son, Ham, had what it had done to him, he'd come in and seen that he was naked. And then what did he do? He runs out and says, guess what I just saw? I saw Dad in the buff. So Noah says, cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. So we have this example, the first vineyard, the first, Noah went on a drinking binge, and then, his hangover, he was so grumpy that he cursed not his son, but his grandson Canaan. So, from a historical perspective of vineyards and drinking and hangover, you gotta know this story. And Noah was the first. But can you imagine the shame that the other two brothers must have felt, or the social implications of seeing your parents, your father or mother naked must have been, because of the trouble they went. So here they are, they pick up a cloak off the ground and they hold it between them, and they're backing into the tent. They're not looking at their father. They're going to cover him up, and so they lay it down and cover him up so they don't have to do that. That amount of respect, that amount of care, and then their younger brother just walked in on him and gawked. To me, that's just such an impactful story that there was such importance in that. So, and I'm sorry, I'm getting off course here, but I just like that aspect of the story. So just to confirm that they did grow grapes during that time period, and that they did have active wineries. This is the remnants of a winery in the Negev desert, which is in the southern part of Israel. And these rooms would have been storage rooms for the fruit. So they would have been brought and stored in here. This is the pressing floor where they would have been pressed, probably stomped, or they may have used some kind of wood boards or some mechanism to squeeze juice out of the grapes. The floor kind of slopes towards the middle where you can see this hole, and you can't see it from this angle, but there's a pipe that goes from the base of this hole into a collection vat over here. I've got another shot that shows that. That's the collection vat. So the juice from up here pours and goes down into this collection vat, and then it would have been taken out and put into some kind of jars for further fermentation. Here's a view from the below. This is the pressing floor, and then this is the collection vat. Pretty large collection area, so they could make a significant amount of wine here. So wine was extremely important, and like I said, raisins, don't get hung up on those little boxes of raisins that we get. Make your own and get some good grapes and just experience the different flavors of raisins. I'm going to stop now because I've been going for an hour and a half and I don't want to wear you out, but I just wanted to show you some of the example plants that are in the Bible. Almonds, apricots, aloe, barley, we've already talked about barley, caper, bean caper, black mustard, bottle gourd, broad bean, carob, cassia, we talked about cedar of Lebanon, cinnamon, etrog, we talked about that, cucumber, somebody mentioned, date palm, figs, frankincense, fragrant cane or calamus, garlic, gopher wood or cypress, we talked a little bit about that, grape, hyacinths, there's strong suspicion that hyacinths are one of the flowers that are mentioned in the Bible. Madonna lily, some people believe that, and mountain tulips are also some of the flowers mentioned. Myrrh, narcissus, olives, onions, Palestine oak, papyrus, pomegranate, saffron, crocus, shittim wood or acacia. That's the wood that the ark was made out of, as well as the tabernacle holding together of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. Was shittim wood, sorghum, spikenard or nard, Syrian hyssop, not European hyssop. Syrian hyssop is the hyssop that's in the Bible, that's both in the story of Passover as well as in the passage in Psalms where the psalmist is requesting to purge me with hyssop. That's probably Syrian hyssop, which is not a fragrant flowering plant, which is what European hyssop is. Syrian hyssop is the best way to describe it is it's oregano. It's a wild native herb that looks like oregano. It's got really small, clumpy green leaves and grew during that area. But we're convinced that's what hyssop is in the Bible. Watermelon, wheat, and wormwood. So I just want you to be aware of the diversity of plants. And this is by no means all of them. It's just a good example of a cross-sectional list of plants. And I wish we had enough time to go through them all, because I love talking about it, and I can tell you little exciting stories about each one of them and hopefully make it interesting, but I don't want to wear out my audience. I certainly don't want to be the only thing between, I always admired ministers and preachers about that. It's such a tough time to work. It's right before lunch, and you realize, it must be really hard to realize, you're the only thing between this group of people and a full satiated stomach. And so I don't want to be that person that's the only thing between you and lunch. So I'm going to open it up for questions at this point in time.
So there's no apple?
There is apple. Yes. Okay. But it is not malice. It is not the apple that we eat as apple. It is apricot. So when you see references to apple in the Bible, most likely it's apricot. We know that for a lot of reasons. Number one, the modern apple is a hybrid between Asian apples and the European small crab apple. Number two, there are no apples of any significance that are native to the Middle East. The closest would be Turkey. And like I said, it was a very small sour apple. Apricots had been introduced long ago. We have documentation of apricot seeds over 2000 BC in that region. So from the standpoint of the author of of when the apple appears, like in Song of Solomon, the author of Song of Solomon, when they talk about apples, that's probably the fragrance, that's probably the fruit. Now, the other question to ask is, what's the forbidden fruit? And we have no reason biblically to think that it's an apple. We've all been misled if we think that the apple is the forbidden fruit. And there's a lot of, and I have a whole talk on the forbidden fruit, but that comes about from writers Dante was one of them, that wrote about historical biblical translation perspective from his point of view. And then the Renaissance painters, that when they would paint the Garden of Eden, they would always paint the fruit like an apple. But there's no biblical basis for it being an apple. We don't know what the forbidden fruit was. We have no information for it. And you know, when you think of the creation story and you think of this Garden of Eden, who's to say it's even a fruit that is around today? It's going to be a fun one to ask. I know that. So, but did that answer your question about apple? Yeah, the word apple does appear in the Bible, but not associated with the forbidden fruit.
You spoke of mint, earlier as, going into the temple. And how about the idea of like the frankincense and the myrrh and the incense being burnt to keep down flies and such from the, blood from the sacrifices and such?
Could have been.
Always incense going.
Right.
Just kind of makes sense that it might have been a deterrent for some of those flies and insects and things like that.
It's a good hypothesis. It could have been, yeah. And there's actually a recipe for an incense that was supposed to have been used in the tabernacle, but it strictly says in Scripture that we are not to repeat and use this outside of the temple or outside of the tabernacle. The good news is we couldn't, even if we wanted to, because two of the ingredients we didn't even know what they are. One of them we're not sure if it's a shellfish or if it's a plant like a gumball. I mean, so the good news is we're safe. We're not going to kill ourselves.
The Garden of Gethsemane, however you pronounce that. And then in John, Jesus says, "My Father is the gardener." Was the garden? What was a garden in the biblical times compared to today?
Excellent question. It would have been more in line with what I said earlier of a grove of trees. It would have been very compact. They probably would have walled it. It would have been like a small orchard. Would have been a garden in biblical times, and it would have been mainly for food production of some type. It wouldn't have been a flower garden. Wouldn't have been an ornamental garden. Yes. So when they talk about the Garden of Gethsemane, I'm 100% sure that it would have mainly been an olive orchard. There could have been some pomegranates there. There could have been some figs, but a garden would have been mainly fruit trees or some type of fruit production. Excellent question. In the back.
With wheat and barley so available, was there any mention of beer? I know they made beer in those times.
They did. The Egyptians, we have documentation of the Egyptians making beer. There's a couple of references to strong drink that are mentioned in the Bible, and there's some assumption or suspicion that they could have been talking about beer, but it could have been like the liquor I talked about, the liqueur that was made from the syrup from dates. And I would assume that they were familiar with and would have had access to the technology to make beer. We know the Egyptians were doing it for many years, but there's no direct reference to beer in the Bible per se. There is strong drink, and there's definitely wine, but the strong drink could have been a liqueur, liquor made out. Good question. We don't know. Sorry, I can't answer.
How about tares? Is that just sort of a generic term, or is it something?
Yeah. I ran out of time. That's one of my other favorite stories. That's the parable of wheat and tares. It is a specific Lolium tenulentum is tares. It's in the grass family. It looks very similar to wheat. And so if you remember that story, what happened was this guy bought seed and he planted his wheat field. And then someone came in at night and they seeded tares amongst his wheat. And then his workers came to him and said, well, you must have bought bad seed because all these tares are coming up. You want us to go out there and pull them up? And the owner of the land said, no, let's wait till the harvest time and then we'll deal with this situation. And so then he gives explicit instructions to his workers to go out in the field and first collect all the tares, pull them up by their roots, bundle them together, set them aside, and burn them. Then you can collect the wheat and you can take the grain from them. And so when you think of this story, you think, that's real interesting. That's a lot of work, isn't it? Why not just pull up the wheat and harvest it and leave the tares in the field? Well, there's a reason. Because tares were infected by a fungus. It's probably the closest thing I can think of is ergot, which gets on other grains. And this fungus produces a toxin that will kill whatever eats it. So if cattle went in or sheep went into that field and ate the tares that were left, it would kill them because of the mycotoxin from this fungal infection that was on the tares. So when you think of, now that I'm glad you brought it up, here's another example. If you didn't know that backstory, you would think, well, what's the big deal? Somebody just planted some weed seed. No, that person was trying to kill them and kill their animals. And so, and knowing, everyone knew at that point in time, that's why the person says, burn it. We want to burn it. We want to get rid of this. It's insidious. It can kill us. So here's another example of, if you know the backstory, the scripture has a lot more significance and symbolism. I'm glad you brought that up. So tares, and seriously, I don't mean this flippantly, it's the first example that I can think of bioterrorism. I mean, somebody deliberately tried to kill someone based on a bioterrorism type of event. Good question. Any other question?
Well, let's give Dr. Bailey a round. Thank you for coming tonight. We are recording this and we'll try to get it online. If you're a friend of ours on Facebook at the center, look this evening, maybe it'll be on there, you can share it with a friend, okay? In your seats, there is an evaluation form. We always strive to improve and to do better, so if you can take a little time, we have some pens in the back, UGA pens, if you want to take one with you, you may. But please leave us a form and have a great day, folks.
No, that was just a small excerpt. I love the larger course.
Great.
That's about. I have the frankincense and the myrrh. Have you ever put them on a hot light bulb?
I have not.
Keeps the smoke out of the house.